The phone trembled in the young woman's hands as her voice broke. Behind her, hidden just beyond the slightly open door, a man in an elegant suit held his breath. Carlos Romero, 38 years old, owner of Madrid's most luxurious five-star hotel, had checked in disguised as an ordinary guest to test his new staff. But what he was about to overhear during that call would change everything. The new housekeeper, still wearing yellow gloves stained with soap, pressed the phone to her ear as tears began to fall. Her next words would reveal a secret so heartbreaking that Carlos would be forced to make an impossible decision. This is the story of how a deception meant to expose the dishonest ended up uncovering the purest truth a human heart can hold. Carlos Romero had built his empire over 13 years. The Hotel Real de Madrid was his creation. 5 floors of luxury in the heart of the city, near Puerta del Sol, with 200 rooms, 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, and a spa for VIPs. But success came at a price: constant paranoia. In recent months, he'd noticed discrepancies in the accounts, supplies costing too much, towels going missing, cash from the registers not adding up. The manager, Javier Martin, insisted everything was under control, but Carlos no longer trusted anyone. So he decided to check in incognito, without his famous name or special treatment. Just Carlos Garcia, a businessman from Barcelona, booking a standard room with fake ID. He wanted to see how his hotel really operated when the owner wasn't watching. The first few days were eye-opening: a bartender pouring shorter drinks, a waiter pocketing tips, small dishonesties, but not enough. He needed solid proof, especially from housekeeping. Maids saw everything. They had access to cash left on nightstands, jewelry forgotten in bathrooms. There were 6 housekeepers on the second floor. 5 seemed professional, but the 6th was new. Her name tag read Laura Sanchez, maybe 26, brown hair tied back, crisp blue uniform. She moved with a nervous determination, like someone who desperately needed the job. Carlos decided to focus on her. That morning, he left his room messy on purpose. €50 clearly visible on the nightstand, an expensive watch in the bathroom sink, a gold necklace on the bed, perfect bait. He stepped out but stayed hidden in the hallway, watching. 10 minutes later, he saw her arrive with the cart. She knocked 3 times, got no answer, and entered, leaving the door slightly ajar. Carlos crept closer silently. Laura made the bed with precise movements. She saw the money but didn't touch it. She cleaned the bathroom, gently moved the watch to wipe underneath, and placed it back exactly as it was. She carefully folded the necklace and set it safely on the nightstand. Carlos was about to leave, satisfied, when Laura's phone buzzed. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and her face changed completely. The color drained away, her eyes filled with fear. She answered with trembling hands, and what Carlos overheard changed everything. Laura's voice when she picked up was small, broken, desperate. Carlos pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. She was talking to the hospital. It was Diego Sanchez's mother who had received the urgent message. As she listened, her legs started shaking. She leaned against the bed, then sat down as if she could no longer stand. With her free hand, she covered her mouth to stifle a sob. Carlos couldn't see her, but he could hear enough. Something terrible was happening. She kept saying she understood, that she'd be there right away, to do whatever was necessary, that money wasn't an issue, even though it clearly was. When she hung up, she sat motionless for a moment, shoulders shaking. Then she suddenly stood, wiped her eyes roughly, and finished cleaning frantically. Her movements had become mechanical as silent tears fell. Carlos didn't know what to do. He had come looking for thieves, not this. But there was something about Laura's quiet desperation that squeezed his heart. She finished in record time. Everything was perfect. The money exactly where he'd left it, the watch untouched, the necklace safely on the nightstand. She hadn't stolen a thing. Yet she was in crisis, and Carlos realized he couldn't ignore it. He called Javier and asked for Laura Sanchez's file. Hired a week ago, perfect references, desperately needed the job. Single mother with a son, fired from her previous position for taking too many days off for family emergencies. Carlos asked what kind of emergencies. Something about her sick son. Javier didn't know details. Carlos sat on the bed Laura had so carefully made and stared at the €50. Pocket change to him. A fortune to her. Yet she hadn't touched it. He made a decision. He would find out what was going on, not as the owner, but as a human being. Carlos spent the rest of the day making discreet inquiries. What he learned broke his heart. Diego Sanchez was 7 years old. He'd been born with a rare genetic disease affecting his lungs and heart. He needed constant care and expensive medication. Laura had raised him alone after the father vanished upon learning about the illness. For 6 years, she'd fought to keep him alive, working double shifts, taking out impossible loans, selling everything she owned. A month earlier, Diego had taken a turn for the worse. He needed surgery that cost €40,000. The public health system would do it, but the waiting list was 8 months long. The doctors said Diego didn't have 8 months. Maybe 3 or 4, if he was lucky. Laura had tried everything to raise the money. Every bank turned her down, she was already too deep in debt. Family couldn't help. An online fundraiser had collected €3,000, a drop in the ocean. Then she was fired for needing too much time off for Diego. No job, no money, a dying child. The position at the Hotel Real had been a miracle. She saved every penny, skipped meals, walked instead of taking the bus, bought second-hand clothes, everything for Diego. But it would never be enough. Even saving every cent for 6 months, she wouldn't reach half the amount. And Diego didn't have 6 months. Carlos read it all and felt something he hadn't felt in years. He'd built his empire by hardening his heart. But looking at photos of Laura with her little boy outside the hospital, something inside him cracked. The next day, he called the hospital, pretending to be a relative. The nurse was firm, Diego was stable, but time was running out. Maybe 6 weeks before the condition became irreversible. Surgery was needed immediately. Carlos asked the exact cost, €42,000. Impossible for a housekeeper. Nothing to a millionaire. He didn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about Laura cleaning while crying, refusing to steal €50. About Diego, who had done nothing to deserve this illness. He could pay it easily, €42,000 was less than the painting he'd just bought for the lobby. But giving the money meant revealing who he was, getting involved, opening a door he'd kept locked for years. At 3 a.m., he made a decision. He wouldn't give the money directly. He had to find a way that let Laura keep her dignity while doing what his heart was suddenly telling him to do. Over the next few days, Carlos devised a plan. It had to be perfect. Laura could never know the money came from him. He told Javier to organize a staff lottery with a €50,000 prize, enough for Diego's surgery. Javier thought it odd, but Carlos was the boss. The problem was making sure Laura won without it looking rigged. Then he had a better idea. A competition based on performance. The housekeeper with the best guest reviews over the next month would win. Perfect, because Laura was good. Maybe the best. In the days that followed, Carlos kept pretending to be a regular guest. He always requested Laura for his room and left glowing reviews. He also spoke to other guests he knew, asking them to request her and leave positive feedback if the work was good. And it always was. He watched Laura from afar. How she arrived half an hour early, stayed an hour late, never complained. A week later, Laura was cleaning a suite when her phone rang again. Carlos was nearby, pretending to wait for the elevator. It was the hospital. Diego had suffered a respiratory crisis, not critical, but a warning. Time was running out. Laura tried to stay calm. She said she was doing everything possible. Please keep Diego stable, she'd come after work. When she hung up, she didn't cry. She just stared at the phone with an empty expression, the look of someone who had fought so long they had no tears left. Only ruthless determination, because giving up meant losing everything. Carlos felt his resolve harden. He couldn't wait a month. Diego didn't have a month. He called Spain's top pediatric cardiovascular surgeon. Explained the situation without names. Asked how much time Diego really had. The surgeon was blunt, with those symptoms, maybe 3 weeks. 4 at most. Surgery needed immediately. 3 weeks. He couldn't wait. But how to give Laura the money without destroying her pride? He spent the night thinking. By dawn, he had a risky, complicated plan. It would mean partially revealing who he was, but it was the only way to save Diego and let Laura hold her head high. The next day, Carlos told Javier to summon Laura to his office. When Javier asked why, Carlos just said do it, no questions. There was something in his voice that made the manager obey without protest. Laura arrived at the manager's office looking terrified, clearly thinking she was about to be fired. Her hands were clenched in front of her, knuckles white. When she walked in and saw Carlos sitting behind the desk beside Javier, she looked even more confused. Carlos studied her for a long moment, then asked Javier to leave him alone. The manager looked surprised but obeyed, closing the door behind him. Laura stood trembling in front of the desk. Carlos motioned for her to sit. She perched on the edge of the chair, ready to bolt or collapse, it wasn't clear which. He began calmly. He explained that he wasn't Carlos Garcia, the guest, he was Carlos Romero, owner of the Hotel Real. He had checked in undercover to test the staff, to see how the hotel ran when he wasn't around. Laura went even paler. She probably thought she was finished, that everything she'd worked for was collapsing. But Carlos continued. He said he'd observed her work for days. He'd seen her dedication, her honesty, the way she treated every room like it was the most important. He'd seen that she hadn't taken the money he'd deliberately left out. He'd seen an employee who was exactly the kind of person he wanted at his hotel. Laura listened in silence, tears starting to form. Then Carlos said something that stunned her. He told her he had also accidentally overheard her hospital call. It wasn't intentional, it happened while he was testing staff, but now he knew about Diego, about the surgery, about how little time was left. Laura started shaking her head, tears streaming freely. She began apologizing, saying her personal problems had never affected her work, that she'd always been professional, that she'd never ask for special treatment or time off. Carlos raised a hand to stop her. He said she had nothing to apologize for. She'd done flawless work under impossible circumstances. Anyone else would have fallen apart. She had kept showing up, doing her job perfectly, holding on to her dignity even as her world crumbled. Then he made the offer. The hotel had an emergency fund for employees in crisis. It was little known because it was rarely used, but it existed. Carlos had decided to use that fund to cover the full cost of Diego's surgery. It wasn't charity. It was an investment in a valuable employee who had proven integrity and dedication. Laura stared at him in disbelief, unable to speak. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Carlos went on. There was one condition: once Diego recovered and was stable, Laura would stay with the hotel for at least 2 years. He wanted her to become head of housekeeping, training new staff, passing on her work ethic. She wouldn't repay the money. She'd repay it with her time and knowledge. Finally, Laura found her voice. In a broken whisper, she asked why he was doing this. He didn't know her. They were strangers. Carlos was honest. He said he'd built his empire by putting profit before people. He'd hardened his heart because he thought that was the only way to succeed. But watching her work with such dedication while her world fell apart had taught him something. Real value wasn't in numbers on a balance sheet. It was in people who showed up every day and gave their best, even when no one was watching. Laura began to sob. She couldn't believe it was real. Carlos stood, walked around the desk, and placed a hand on her shoulder. He told her it was real. Diego would have his surgery, and she wouldn't have to carry this weight alone anymore. Suddenly Laura stood and hugged him, sobbing into his expensive shirt. He froze for a moment, then slowly hugged her back. It felt strange. He hadn't hugged anyone with real emotion in years, but it felt right. When Laura calmed enough to speak, she asked when the surgery could be scheduled. Carlos said he'd already contacted Spain's best surgeon. It was set for the following week. Diego would be transferred to a private clinic with the best possible care. Laura couldn't stop crying and thanking him. Carlos told her to go home, be with Diego, take all the time she needed. Her job would be waiting when she was ready. The surgery was a success. Diego was operated on by Spain's top pediatric heart surgeon in a state-of-the-art private clinic. 8 delicate hours. But in the end, the doctor came out smiling. Diego would make it. Carlos was there in the waiting room with Laura. He hadn't planned to be, he'd only intended to call for an update. But on the morning of the surgery, he realized he couldn't stay away. He wanted to be there, not as the hotel owner, but as a human being who cared. When the surgeon announced success, Laura collapsed in tears of relief. Carlos held her as she cried, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel something deeper than cold business calculation. Diego's recovery was long but steady, weeks in the hospital, then months of physical therapy. Carlos visited regularly. At first he told himself it was just to check on his investment. But the truth was different. He enjoyed seeing the boy, hearing his laughter as he got stronger, watching color return to his cheeks. Diego was bright and sweet, a child who had spent half his life in hospitals yet hadn't lost his ability to smile. When he learned Carlos was the kind man who had helped his mom, he hugged him tightly and asked if he could call him Uncle Carlos. Carlos, who had never wanted family or personal ties, felt something in his chest tighten and open at the same time. He said yes. Laura returned to work after 3 months, once Diego was stable enough for school. But she didn't return as a housekeeper. Carlos kept his promise and promoted her to head of housekeeping. Her salary tripled. She had an office, real responsibilities, respect. But most importantly, she had hope. For the first time in years, she could look to the future without terror. Diego was okay. They were okay. All because of a man who had checked in undercover. And a desperate mother who had never lost her integrity. A year later, Carlos invited Laura and Diego to dinner, not at one of the hotel restaurants, but at his private apartment, a place few people had ever seen. He cooked himself, something he hadn't done in years, paella, the way his mother had taught him before she died. After dinner, while Diego watched cartoons in the living room, Carlos and Laura sat on the balcony overlooking Madrid at night. Laura thanked him again. Carlos shook his head. He said he was the one who should be grateful. She had reminded him why he'd started all this, why he'd worked so hard to build something. It wasn't for money or power, it was to make a difference in people's lives. Laura said something he'd never forget, that God had sent Carlos disguised as an ordinary guest, because sometimes miracles arrive in disguise. You have to look past the surface to see them. Carlos laughed and said maybe she was right. He had pretended to be someone else to uncover the truth about others. In the process, he had uncovered a truth about himself, that he didn't have to be just a cold businessman. He could be more. 3 years later, the Hotel Real de Madrid had a new policy. Any employee facing financial hardship due to medical or family emergencies could apply to the emergency fund. Carlos had expanded it enormously after Diego. In 3 years, it had helped 23 employees. Some repaid the money when they could. Others didn't. Carlos didn't care. Laura had become director of operations, the second highest position after Javier. Diego, now 10, was a healthy, lively boy who wanted to be a doctor when he grew up, to help other kids the way he'd been helped. Carlos was still the owner, still a successful businessman, but he was something more now, 2. An uncle to a boy with no blood tie who had captured his heart. A friend to a woman who had shown him that true strength means never giving up, even when the world collapses. Someone who had learned that sometimes you have to pretend to be someone else to discover who you really are. From time to time, as he walked the hotel corridors, he would pause and watch the staff working. He'd remember that day he stood hidden, listening to a mother cry on the phone. He'd remember how everything changed, and he'd smile. Because sometimes the best investment isn't in stocks or property, it's in people. And sometimes the greatest return isn't money, it's knowing you saved a life, and in the process saved your own soul. 5 years after that call changed everything, the Hotel Real wasn't just Madrid's most luxurious, it was known as the place where employees were treated like family, where people in crisis found help instead of judgment, where Laura's integrity had become the standard everyone tried to meet. Carlos had expanded the program to other hotels he acquired. The Diego Fund, as he called it privately, though it had a more formal public name, had helped hundreds of employees across Spain. Diego was 15 now, completely healthy, and worked weekends at the hotel. He wanted to learn the business from the ground up before college. Carlos had told him there would always be a place for him if he wanted it after graduation. Laura had married a kind doctor she met during one of Diego's checkups. A man who loved both her and her son. Carlos walked her down the aisle, proud as any real father would be. And Carlos had finally understood what family meant. It wasn't just blood, it was choosing to show up for someone day after day. It was seeing someone at their lowest and deciding to stay. It was pretending to be someone else and discovering who you really are along the way. The photo on his nightstand phone wallpaper wasn't of his hotel or his achievements. It was of him, Laura, and Diego at a park picnic, all laughing at something Diego had said. He looked at that photo every morning when he woke up. It reminded him that the most precious thing he'd ever found hadn't been on a balance sheet or in an investment.